Everybody, I think we'll know as well. Thank you for coming to this policy exchange and Tesco event. The theme is how can UK Plc innovate to help Britain win the global race? So helping us answer that question over the next almost an hour. See to my right, Steve Hughes, Head of Economics and Social Policy at the Policy Exchange, having previously worked at the Bank of England, among other places. Jeremy Browne is probably known to many of you as the MP for Thornsby, and he was, after the coalition was formed, appointed as a minister in the Foreign Office, where he spent a couple of years and then went to the Home Office. And Angela Maurer from Tesco, Head of Innovation, I think, at Tesco Labs. So it sounds like a fascinating job. I'm sure will enable Angela to give a unique perspective to this talk. So I think our three speakers are just going to give some introductory remarks. You can have up to 10 minutes if you like. I think we're going to go with you first, Jeremy.
Thank you, Nick. Good evening, everybody. Thank you to Policy Exchange. Thank you to Tesco, extremely successful British business. And it's a subject which I'm extremely enthusiastic about. And when I got some invitations to speak at various events at our conference, it leapt off the page because I waste no opportunity to try and evangelicize. Is that a word? It is, but not the way I pronounce it, about this topic. I suppose the starting point is to accept that there is a global race in the first place. And there are quite a few people who criticise that expression, and I accept that it's not a race in a conventional sense. It doesn't have a finishing line, is one way that it's not a conventional race, but also actually the other competitors provide opportunities as well as threats to us in terms of our success in that race. And I appreciate that that it's not just about beating the others, it's about how we can interact with others and collaborate with others to our mutual benefit. But it does, it seems to be, capture the energy, the vitality that we will need to have as a country in order to be successful. And I end up sometimes having conversations with people saying, well, it's not a race, and it's not. And I say, okay, it's just an expression, don't get too hung up on it. What it's important to get across is that there is not a settled global hierarchy that is fixed for all time. And the countries of the industrialised West have the ability or the potential to go downhill and to become much less relatively prosperous and powerful and influential than they currently are, unless those countries take conscious decisions to get themselves into another place. And the hierarchies change and they evolve the whole time, but if you look at our situation in the West, we have some pretty deep-seated problems. We have aging populations. Our dependency ratio of working age people to non-working age people are much worse in terms of the costs that are incurred. That is the case in many other parts of the world. We have a very high welfare reliance in public expenditure terms. So Angela Merkel made the famous comment that 7% of the world's population was in Europe, about 25% of the world's economy, and about 50% of the world's welfare spending. And that clearly has implications for us. We are very heavily indebted, so we are, in this country, borrowing about huge amounts of money. We're £50 billion a year just on the interest on our debt. By the end of next year, it'll be £70 billion a year, and that's obviously a serious liability for us. We have aging infrastructure. One of the most striking things I felt as a foreign office minister, I travelled very widely in Latin America and Asia. Latin American infrastructure is always uniformly useless. It's a big barrier to that part of the world achieving its economic objectives. But Asian infrastructure is pretty impressive and getting more impressive. Of course, admittedly in the big cities, but the pace of change is very, very evident there. And the protracted debates we have about quite small improvements in our infrastructure work with the assumption that we have no downside to prevarication and delay. And I disagree with that. I think there is a downside to prevarication and delay, and it's we fall behind the competition. So we need to realise that we live in a more competitive global environment, and that unless we take remedial steps, we will fall behind. That not all of the countries that have been prosperous in the last 50 years, in 50 years' time, will still be at the top table of world affairs, and we have to make sure that we are in that position. So very briefly, what sort of things will we be doing? And then you look at a whole range of different areas. I mean, I think we need to have a very outward-looking disposition. I think we should embrace the opportunities of globalisation. I think Britain has lots of attributes which can make us successful as a country and can make our businesses and our people globally successful. Our capacity for invention and innovation, the fact we speak English, the admiration that we are held in lots of parts of the world. There are lots of assets. There's no reason why Britain is deemed to fail. We can, in my view, succeed. But we have to make sure that we have the infrastructure that supports a modern economy, and in my view we don't. And the decision that was taken by a conference today on aviation policy showed a complete detachment from reality, in my view, in terms of what challenges our country faces to be prosperous and outward-looking. We need to make sure that our education standards are raised, not just for the people at the higher levels of attainment, where our education provision is globally competitive, but across all tiers of educational attainment. At the moment, we're not doing well enough. So if you look at international comparison studies, and you can quibble with the methodology, but in international comparative studies, in the three measurements they make of 15-year-olds, the United Kingdom is not in the top 20 in any of those three categories. And yet we constantly hear that, from Ed Miliband and others, that we're going to be a knowledge economy, that we're not going to join this race to the bottom. But the countries he has in mind of being at the bottom are in some cases getting higher levels of educational attainment than we are. South Korea, Singapore, Japan, all of these countries are in the top 10 for all three of the measured attainment criteria, and we are not in the top 20. And if we want to be a knowledge economy, we have to be more knowledgeable than the competition, particularly because we don't have other attributes that other countries do have. So China has 1.4 billion people. They don't need all of those people to be educated at the highest standard to be an influential country, but we have less than 1% of the world's population. Saudi Arabians have huge amounts of oil, but we don't have enormous resources in terms of energy and natural resources. Give an example, that Panamanians, not a hugely important country in the grand scheme of things, small population, but they have the asset of their geographic location. Our geographic location is fine, but it's not a strategic asset in the way that the Panamanians is for them. Our greatest asset is the propensity of our people to be innovative and inventive, but we need to be firing on all cylinders. Countries in the early stages of development can afford to have an elite cadre who will make the decisions and drag the wider population through. That isn't the case for us. There are fewer and fewer jobs for people with low skills and no skills, and we need to make sure that our education attainment is not just excellent in global terms at the Oxford and Cambridge level, which it is, but is excellent across the board. I think we need political ideas about how we can be more successful, how we can support entrepreneurialism and wealth creation and businesses to a greater extent than we do at the moment. A lot of our political debate about globalisation, about free trade, in my view, is too negative, it's too defensive, and we need to think more about how we can succeed. Maybe I'll leave my sort of further thoughts to the questions. But then look at a company like Tesco, expanded into South Korea, expanded to Thailand, there's great opportunities for us to develop relations at commercial level, cultural level, political level, with people in those two increasingly important countries. Opportunity for Tesco to be a bigger and more successful company, and you can see a lot of our companies that are exploring opportunities in Asia and particularly in Latin America and elsewhere. It's difficult to break into markets, but this is where the growth is happening in the world. We talk so much about what's happening in Europe and about the Middle East, but actually there is a big, almost untold story out there about the very dramatic expansion that is happening in Asia in particular. We are seeing, this is the phenomenon of our time, the shift from the West to the East in terms of economic power. And we have to make sure that we are not left behind as that phenomena gathers pace. And it's good that we're having a fringe at this time so we can talk about the sort of ideas that we will need to embrace, in my view, not just as a country, but as a party, to make sure that we are relevant to that debate and that Britain can have a successful future.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Steve, over to you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about technology and globalisation. I'm going to talk a little bit about education, infrastructure as well as business support when we talk about the global race. The first thing I'd say on technology is that it's obviously changed the way we consume, it's changed the way we do business, it's changed the way that we're educated, and it's raised living standards for all. But the real question is what is the role of the state in an increasingly globalised world? And I'm going to talk about, firstly, children in school. So a few weeks ago we had a group of kids starting school who are going to start learning coding and computing, which is fundamentally a good thing. And that's not anything about the state dictating that we're going to have an army of app builders or web designers in the future. It's about ensuring that people or our future workforce have the relevant types of skills to succeed in what we're doing. And that's fundamentally important for us and the future of our businesses and the people that they can hire to succeed in a globalised world. But there is another side to that, which is the fact that these kids going to school now could well, if the pace of change continues at its present rate, and they leave school or leave university, end up in jobs which actually don't exist now. And it's the speed of that change which is actually quite frightening for some people. And we need to take account of the people that technology leaves behind. So, for example, I'll take banking as an example of this, where technology and the internet have changed its business models. So we have a situation whereby a lot of people do their banking through their smartphones at the moment, and that's led to a retrenchment of bank branches through a lot of the major institutions, not all of them, but most of them. People engage with vendors in different ways. Now, what does that mean for the SMEs that formerly had a credit officer in their local bank branch but no longer do and don't understand local labour market conditions? What does that mean for the 10 million people in the UK that lack basic digital skills? And by lacking basic digital skills, I mean that they can't send an email or they can't use a search engine. We need to understand what it means for them. Jeremy talked about the low-skilled workers, and this is one of the biggest debates in the economics literature at the moment, which is ultimately jobs are being destroyed by disruptive technologies, but they're being created elsewhere. What do you do with those people who lose their jobs? So people who used to staff the bank branches, where do they go for jobs in the future now? On the second point about infrastructure, I think Jeremy basically said it all, probably far better than I would, but a few statistics to kind of hammer home the point are always worth throwing in there. Some of my favourites are that between 2000 and 2009, the UK built 46 extra miles of motorway. In the same period, France built 850 miles of extra motorway, and Germany built 680 miles of extra motorway. Now, they've got bigger geographic areas, sure, but that doesn't account for the size of the change. They have lower traffic densities, and as a result, they can move freight and people around their economy much more easily than we can. On housing, which has been incredibly popular as fringe events throughout the conference season, we need to build 300,000 homes a year to cope with a lack of supply at the moment, but to meet future demand as well. We're building just over 100,000 at the moment. And on the airport capacity debate, I mean, the point is actually, it's all right saying which decision is right or wrong, but actually getting to a decision would be a starting point. which we can't seem to do at the moment. I mean, if Davies Commission says that we need a Heathrow third runway next year, and we do get that off the ground, we'd essentially be in the same position as we were 10 years ago. And during those 10 years, other people have been building stuff and chipping away at our competitiveness. The final point I'll make is around business support, and again, Gemma touched on this a little bit. I used to work for a business lobby organisation that dealt specifically with exporters, and it was very clear why 50% of our goods and services went to continental Europe, because there's less language barriers, there's geographic proximity, the way of doing business is very similar, and it's better the devil you know for a lot of organisations trying to export and sell their goods abroad. The problem is can the state do anything to actually help business penetrate those markets in the Far East or in Latin America to ensure that they can take opportunities for these growths? And there is, I mean, I fundamentally believe there's a role for the state in UK trade and investment or Commonwealth Office in promoting British businesses. But we need to understand that this isn't a 5-year thing, it's not a 10-year thing, it's a 50-year thing, 100-year thing, century-long thing. The reason that we have stronger links to the Commonwealth countries rather than beyond our European partners is simply because of the way the history and our trade links we held previously with them. And it's important to remember that in terms of not only through export support through UKTI, but through state support for provision of finance with organisations as well. So you look at somewhere like America, you look at somewhere like Germany that have these state institutions that help provide businesses with finance, which we're trying to model our state intervention on at the moment. They've existed for decades, chance to integrate themselves within the funding landscape of businesses, and we need to ensure that that time or that long-term approach is adopted in the UK as well.
Thank you, Steve. Ash?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. It's actually my first trip to Glasgow, so I was really pleased to land with the sun shining.
It's always like that.
Yeah. I was a bit worried that it might be raining, and apparently putting to the taxi driver probably didn't want it. Anyway, so just to introduce myself briefly. So I've been with Tesco for 14 years. I actually joined as a graduate. I actually have a computer science degree, so I came through the technology route. I've spent probably actually most of my years at Tesco within the commercial and marketing teams until recently, the last 3 years, coming back to actually head up set up and then lead the innovation team, which we relaunched in January under the name Tesco Labs. So it's been very, very exciting 14 years. I think the excitement is still continuing at the moment. But with that in mind, I'm going to just give you a few sort of thoughts about Tesco's perspective on how UK PLCs can innovate to help Britain deal with global risks. So we believe digital technology is critical to driving innovation and Britain's long-term success on the global stage. Technology is changing every aspect of our lives, from the way we shop to the way we communicate with our customers, find friends and family. We now have supercomputers in our pockets, which enables us to get everything we want instantly. It just changes the way that we operate. And did you know we spend more time using our smartphones and tablets than we do sleeping, which, as unbelievable as it sounds, I know I wake up in the morning, first thing is I check this, and then I'm on it all through the day, and then last thing at night check it. It's a really bad habit. But as well as changing the way we live our lives, technology is really disrupting our businesses. So it's empowering the next generation of entrepreneurs by providing the tools and conditions to get up and running really quickly. And it's also changing the way we can talk and connect with our customers through social media. And it's not just about email anymore. Social media is a key part of any business's strategy. Thanks to technology, and I say thanks in inverted commas, namely Facebook, 1 in 6 of us took part in the Ice Bucket Challenge. So we've got a small sample audience here. Hands up if you did that. Maybe not quite 1 in 6 in this room. What about the rest of the panel here? I mean, 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, who would have imagined that actually the goal of marketing teams was to try and create that amazing viral campaign via social media? Digital technology is also a key success factor in the transformation of big companies. It's no longer just the domain of the new digital startups like Google, Facebook and Amazon, but companies like us, Tesco and other sort of more traditional long-standing companies need to be adapting and quickly. We think leadership in digital technology is driven by the nexus of three things: people and skills, capital and infrastructure. Tesco has a long history of investment in digital capability and technology, and we've enjoyed great digital success over a number of years by focusing on these three areas. Actually, 2014 is quite an important year for Tesco because it actually marks 50 years of digital innovation, starting with the introduction of our mainframe computer in 1964, which is everything that would be still in place now. Actually, all of our stock price products is all on that system. We had computerised tills in 1982, and in response to changing customer demands, we were the first grocer to launch an online grocery service in 1996. Actually, Bill Gates helped us launch that. We still have that laptop that he touched. And that was our first endeavour. It was a momentous occasion. We have photos and the laptop. But that was the first foray into multi-channel retailing. And from then on, we've just learned rapidly, quickly, as our customer needs change and as our product portfolio diversifies. And since then, we've won numerous awards. And most recently, we've won an award for the Online Supermarket of the Year for the Grocery Gold Awards this year. What I found absolutely fascinating is the rate of technology innovation. It's been exponential over the last 5 years. It's been incredible, and it's still been sustained. So in 5 years' time, if we see the same rate, who knows where we'll be. But to stay on top of these innovations, this is where I come in with Tesco Labs. We formed the Labs team back in January, and it's our in-house innovation team, and we're there to explore those future trends, and with our ever-evolving customer needs, using that to create new products and services. So it's a very fascinating area. And we're doing that because we want to make sure that we're catering for our customer needs in the future, and we believe we can help them make their lives easier. Within the team, we have a range of skill sets, and actually uniquely to Tesco, we have them all together. So we have our designers, developers, product managers, researchers, and we even have a culture and communications team, and also an open innovation manager. Open innovation is an interesting area for us. We're fascinated by the world outside of Tesco. And something that we've done recently is set up it's a business speed dating event called TJAM. And this enables us to go out to the startup community on an almost monthly basis, invite them to come and have an evening of pizza and beer with us, where we get to meet them and they get to meet technologists from around Tesco. It's a great opportunity, it's a great night, and we're always on the lookout for some great sort of collaboration. Huddle is another recent example of great innovation. Since it launched, we've sold 750,000 Huddle tablets, which is incredible and far exceeded our expectations. The device has not only transformed the way customers perceive us, but it's democratized access to digital technology for a whole new segment of customers. And you would have hopefully seen in the news that we've just recently launched Huddle 2, which I think will be in shops on Thursday, and it's bigger, better, faster, and it's really cool. Crucially, Tesco's investment isn't just about finance. It's about developing the people, the skills, and the environment required to stay competitive. But we find ourselves in an ever-increasingly competitive world. And if the UK doesn't foster the digital economy and support innovation, then businesses like us will not be able to flourish in the global economy. And it's not just large companies like Tesco, but the growing army of entrepreneurs. Tesco's traditional supply chain has always been built on supporting SMEs. Jack Cohen's famous quote of "all merchants will grow together" perfectly encapsulates that spirit. So we need policy that helps all businesses, rather than artificially splitting us into big and small. As we know, in the digital world, it's perfectly reasonable to launch a multi-billion-pound business from your bedroom. So how do we foster the digital economy and support innovation? We're living at a time where the youth of today are growing up in a world of technology, and they don't know anything different. And as a consequence, their expectations of how they'll interact with businesses and how businesses will operate will be vastly different from where it is today. And as someone who's leading a technology team to meet those expectations with designing these new experiences, I can tell you that actually finding the people to help me do that is increasingly a huge challenge. This needs addressing now, and we would welcome policymakers to look into improving the education at a higher rate to meet the growing demand of now. It almost goes without saying that in order to meet those expectations, we need the right infrastructure in place. So I think currently the UK has 65% coverage in terms of broadband. We need that to be 100%. And we need to have super fast broadband in order to meet the needs of our customers. And finally, to achieve that, we need a streamlined planning system that facilitates quicker and cheaper implementation of new digital infrastructure, like masts and wireless transmitters. So hopefully that's given you a little brief insight into the world of Tesco and in particular technology innovation. It's a hugely exciting topic. I find it, just the rate of change and the opportunities I find is incredible. So happy to have any more questions.
Thank you, Angela, very interesting. We'll open it up to a bit more of a discussion, so hands are already up. I'll take 3 questions at a time, it's probably simpler. Oh, we've got a microphone.
Yes, sir.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks, panel. My name is Jim, and I work for Stop AIDS, an NGO. It's a coalition of big organisations. I'm going to say one thing without my work hat on, which is just to reflect on the idea that if we're looking to the future, we're looking to where we need to be in terms of our economy and our country in the future. Surely competing on things that, like more motorways and greater air capacity, that are ultimately going to lead to the rise of something that's going to totally change the rules of the game, is more of a traditional approach than innovation should be. And my actual point, what I'm paid to be here to say, is that we work on access to medicines issues. And the biggest threat that we have in terms of co-infections is tuberculosis. So in the last 50 years, we've only developed one new treatment for TB. Mariana Mazzucato has looked at the role that the state plays in ensuring and encouraging innovation. And her research shows that 75% of all new molecular entities that are developed trace their origins to publicly funded labs. Now, just the question there is, we've got an opportunity not only to do a better job of driving innovation in the pharmaceutical sector, but also to ensure that the incentives we place to drive that innovation are better aligned with the needs we have for public health globally, and just to reflect on that and what you believe the UK's role could be in driving the change.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Steve Haynes. I'm the Vice Chair of Lib Dem, so I'm unsurprised we're going to be talking about the fact that you guys have all kind of mentioned education in various forms. Obviously, the type of education that we give people in this country is going to massively impact on how we can innovate within the world of business. But I'm just kind of curious as to what sort of things you guys actually think we need to be focusing on in education to ensure that we are equipping people moving through the education system with the skills necessary so that business can actually utilise them to their fullest potential so that we can grow the economy in the most efficient way.
Thank you very much.
Hello, we're Tony Hill, Maidenhead PPC, ex-head teacher of 22 years, secondary schools. We mentioned the word innovation at the heart of this whole discussion. Just an amusing anecdote, first of all. There was a time when I was called to the Department of Education under Labour because I was going to be introduced to a new whole department called the Department of Innovations. I've been teaching for nearly 35 years, and thought I innovated something every September in every new curriculum. And apparently I had to have special permission to innovate certain things, most of which were in my school already. Now, the reason I mention this, apart from blowing my own trumpet, is really and sincerely. I am very worried if we want innovation in this country, and you might recognise it through computer systems, we actually have layer upon layer in the sectors I know about of compliance management. The one thing that is not demanded of a worker is innovation or an idea that nobody else has either had or researched or explored. But the first thing that some poor devil needs if they say, I've got an idea, is go away and research it. Research can only look at what has already happened. And I do honestly think we've got to have some massive alteration in this. I mean, in particular, within schools, where I happen to be a governor still. If you can go into a head teacher's office anywhere in England and have a conversation for 20 minutes without Ofsted being mentioned, please see me. I want to meet that head teacher. It is an extraordinary regime that we built up from state down. And I hate to say it, within the area of private business, I'm not so sure that's much different. I think we got here accidentally. It's not willfully fascist. It's just much easier to control things if you can make sure there are as few variables as possible to fit them into a computer program or accounting system. And it works against corruption. It doesn't work against new ideas. It's a real problem. I can scorn it, but I can't give you a solution, but I would want people to consider it. There is too much compliance management. That is the model.
Okay, thank you very much. Jeremy, do you want to answer any or all of those?
Can I touch on all three? The problem is that globalisation is such a massive subject that I couldn't quite think what to include next to when I was sort of putting my initial thoughts in. So it's good to draw out some of the strands and themes in this wider discussion. Very quickly, I accept all the points you're making. Let me make two relevant points, although not necessarily answers, but sort of expansions of your point. One is that if you listen to someone like Ed Miliband, I am being partisan, but I actually think he completely fails to see globalisation in anything other than negative terms, and maybe that is true of sort of trade unions and sort of established, slightly defensive-minded people in terms of thinking about our labour market in Britain more widely. And he always talks about sweatshop economy and race to the bottom. And yet, what is striking, of course there is great inequality in the countries that are developing very rapidly in Asia, but hundreds and hundreds of millions of Chinese and Indian people are being lifted out of absolute poverty. I first went to India in 1989, a sort of gap year visit, and it is striking if you go to India. Of course, you see a lot of poor people in India now, but it is striking how much fewer there were than then. And the really, really, really wretched poverty is more scarce. That's not to say it doesn't exist, and there are some states in India that are still extremely poor. But there is a transformation taking place, and you can see what 7 or 8% annual economic growth over a sustained period does to a country. And it means that sanitation systems are so much better, education is so much more widely provided. The reason I say all of this is because I think quite often people talk about globalisation as if it were good for rich people and bad for poor people. And there are threats to the security of relatively poor people in the rich countries. That is an interesting, different facet. But the really absolutely poor people in global terms are seeing opportunities now which are beyond the wildest dreams of their parents, certainly their grandparents. And the second point I was making, relevant to sort of related to what you're saying, is the other thing that quite struck me as a Foreign Office Minister is how much more capacity to do good there will be when more countries are able to contribute to sort of the collective endeavours of humankind. And so, for example, you go to Brazil. People think of Brazil in sort of quite cliche terms. Brazil's science base is increasingly globally respected. And it used to be said to me, oh, Brazil had the best science base outside the G8. That may or may not be true, but they were seen as sort of proper contribution to global affairs, as is a country like South Korea that associated quite a lot of scientific innovation. The reason I say that is, I would be proud if a British person found a cure for cancer, because I'm British, and I think it would be great if our country continued its tradition of innovative, pioneering medical research. but I'd rather a Brazilian or a South Korean found the cure for cancer than no one found the cure for cancer. And the more money there is for cancer research and the more scientists with expertise, the greater the prospects, as well as even more so if we collaborate as we do between universities and other institutions, not just with us and the French and us and the Germans, but increasingly, as I say, us with the Chinese, us with the South Koreans, us with the Mexicans. And that's a really exciting vision, I think, as well. And again, people tend to say, oh gosh, yeah, globalisation, you know, it's all about these big businesses that might do us down, and people have quite a negative perception. But actually, I think the possibilities for the future are good indeed in many ways. In terms of education, I think it's important that, that children have core skills. Not every person is going to be a entrepreneur who makes millions and millions of pounds. Quite a lot of people need to be equipped to work for companies that might be entrepreneurial and make millions of pounds. And we have fewer and fewer jobs in our economy that can be done with people with no qualifications. And some of the people with the fewest or no qualifications struggle in the labour market against imported immigrant labour, if I can put it in those terms. And I've spoken to lots of employers in my constituency and elsewhere, and they say we'd be more than happy to employ some local people. We probably, if it's legal, have a default presumption or preference for employing local people, giving them a decent starting life. But the skills of some of the people from, say, Poland are superior to the skills of some of the local people, particularly those who left school with very few qualifications. So I don't think there is a choice between innovation and core competence in maths, for example. I think you can have core competence in maths and be innovative and creative at the same. So you have excellence in maths and be innovative and creative at the same time. So we do need to make sure that we are, as I say, sort of firing on all cylinders. You know, we are globally competitive at the sort of Russell Group University top schools level. We have the second greatest number of Nobel Prize winners in history after the Americans, and they've got a much bigger population than us. We are the only country in Europe that has universities in the global top 10, and I've seen tables that give us 4 of the world's top 10 universities. That is fantastic, but most people don't go to the 4 best United Kingdom universities, so we need the core skills for the population as a whole. But we also need to develop what is our particular national attribute, so it's very large, which is the innovation thought leadership. I've been to about 25, 30 primary schools in the last 3 weeks in my constituency. Every single one of them mentioned Ofsted, within about 2 minutes of walking in the door. Now, I appreciate my point about needing to ensure that there are core standards. One who said, we used to have a teacher who just played chess all day with the kids. The kids loved him, but none of them learned anything. So I can see that there is something, apart from playing chess, which is important and stretches your mind in lots of ways, but he didn't see that sufficiently rounded education. I think he's probably got a reasonable point. So Ofsted there to make sure that basic standards are adhered to and that we are making sure that children come out with those core skills. But the way we add value in Britain over other countries is in thought leadership, I suppose, is in innovation. And we need to think about how we can enable people not just to know the answers, but to ask the questions in our education system, which is why I am personally quite open to more inventive education. I'm on the non-prescriptive end of the scale beyond the core skills. I personally don't have particular hang-ups about non-qualified teachers. I quite like to get loads of entrepreneurs in. I quite like to do a course in a secondary school where a different entrepreneur came in every week and talked about what made him or her successful. I think we need to be thinking more in those terms. An example I quite often give, what is the most respected and influential newspaper in the world? I think it's the FT. What's the most respected and influential newspaper magazine in the world? I think it's The Economist. What is the most respected and influential broadcast in the world? A bit trickier, but I think you could easily make the case that it's the BBC. All 3 of those are from a country with less than 1% of the world's population. Why? Not because the government decreed that we would be the best at all of those, because in that case, why didn't the Americans decree that they're going to be the best? It's because we have people who are capable of original and imaginative thought, given the opportunity to do that in this country. And that is the best prospect we have for being prosperous as a country in 30, 40 years' time. So raising the skills of everybody, but making sure that we have that capacity at higher levels, I suppose, for the sort of innovation which other countries struggle to replicate. That's used up my car quota.
Can we come back, Mr. Chair?
What were the other
Briefly.
The other one to add is the industry in this country, which has made most on exports of any other industry, up to the creation of the Brit School, was music.
Yeah.
And it was never done as a vocational subject in any school. Not that sort of music. It's quite interesting. But where we made most money on the biggest export, one thing we made sure was that schools had virtually nothing to do with it. Paul McCartney and John Lennon didn't learn their instruments through school.
But our global excellence is quite often our ability to be different, whether it's music or our special forces. The reason they're respected around the world is not because they've got superior equipment necessarily, it's because they have the ability to innovate on the
But it's
battlefield.
something very odd that happened.
Yeah?
As I say, you've got to find ways of doing things that ain't been done.
Sorry.
Just let our other speakers answer any points they want to from the previous round of questions.
Yeah, very briefly. Firstly, on that gentleman's second point is that, I think the bang on about the arts, essentially, and if you speak to a lot of tech companies, they absolutely laud the role that the arts has to play in developing technology. That's a crucial, absolutely. It's a crucial component of trying to make it have a competitive advantage. Back to your point about infrastructure. Look, I take the point that globalisation has changed how we should approach infrastructure, but infrastructure isn't optional. And the point is that it might change what we spend our money on as a nation, how we spend it, and who benefits from it. And taking the broadband example, if you want to talk about rebalancing the economy, broadband infrastructure could potentially be better suited to that than any kind of physical transport infrastructure. But I've seen enough examples to say that the old way of doing things, if we want to call it that, is still incredibly important. It's the reason that Siemens invested in a port in Hull, because we built a road that linked a factory to the port. I mean, these are very important things, and the same goes for airport capacity. On education, the only thing I say, and there's a lot of things we could say about education really, but in terms of going right from primary school to university, one of the things that the government did, that the Coalition did over the last 5 years, was end the post-study work visa for those studying STEM subjects for 2 years after they finished their studies. Overseas applicants, non-EU I should say, overseas applicants to these courses are now dropped off, and they're mobile people going to study and research, do innovation in universities around the world that isn't in the UK, and it contributes to their economies and not ours, and that's something that has to change.
Absolutely. I think it is actually now the Dem policy to bring back the visa. Angela?
Yes. So to your point, while you were explaining sort of your issue with compliance, I was resonating with you. So and I don't know if it helped, but all I can do is share my experience in Tesco, which is when I was trying to set up the innovation team, trying to talk to our senior leaders and saying, right, this is what I want to do. I want to set up lots of different experiments, and out of 100 experiments we set up, maybe one will work, and the rest might fail. And then that word, failure, was just like, you could hear the gasp. And I was like, no, this is all good because we're getting learnings. But my point is actually we've had to go on a journey, and actually so much so that we've created a program, an innovation framework, where we've had to be around and train all of our senior leaders, and given them the right language to use, to have the right behaviours in meetings when you want to be expansive and be creative and come up with your ideas, and then when you want to be reductive. And we've had to have that conversation about if someone comes up with an idea, because we want to encourage ideas, and the last thing we want is somebody coming up from one of our stores maybe saying, I've got a great idea, I just want to do this, and one of our senior teams will stamp on it, because they'll never come up with another idea again. So we've had to go through that, and I think it's been quite a cultural change. I think slowly we're getting there. So I don't know if that helps, but at least we share the same pain. So, and on the education point, I just thought it might be worth just elaborating a bit on the types of skills that I look for when I'm recruiting for my team. Because I guess it's not just the core developer type skills, it's the skills required to I guess as you sort of manage a product life cycle, to think about sort of how do I take that idea and turn it into something, and then also how do I have the right communication skills to actually pitch that idea and try and get people on side. And I think that in itself is an art, and I do believe it can be taught. And I think actually sort of it's the whole sort of, I guess it is the product life cycle. It's not just the sort of the development skills.
Thank you very much. We've got just over 5 minutes, so probably time for a couple more questions.
My name is Neil Moss, and I work in a company called Arkiva, which is responsible for communications and media broadcast infrastructure across the whole of the UK, and we're responsible for Freeview, the digital terrestrial transmitter masts, amongst other things. I think sometimes in conversations like this, we sometimes confuse and play off 3 issues of digital literacy, digital inclusion, and I would also say within that digital access. And as if somehow we cloud them all in, and the 3 things are incredibly different. And inclusion, possibly what I call the Martha Lane Fox agenda of getting people online. And we heard from on the panel that 10 million people in this country have never been online, and, aren't online, is something that in a way may require public subsidy. And it's not just an issue now sitting back looking at business saying, can they do a bit more for their corporate social responsibility. In terms of digital access, I would have thought, looking at it, this is, you could say it's almost a crime in the country. There are people in rural areas that don't have mobile phone signals, let alone talking about who's got super fast broadband, who's got normal broadband, and who's got nothing. So actually, looking at all of this, once again, sometimes government sits back and watches business, and business innovates to a certain extent, or goes where it's economic, for the mobile companies at least, watch, they'll go into areas where it's economically viable for them, and then they'll stop. And so it's trying to, if we want to be ahead of the curve and ahead of other countries, we need to actually start using public subsidy and being quite sensitive to actually looking across. And public Wi-Fi is a great example of that. Some councils are looking at public Wi-Fi and thinking this is what they want in their high streets, this is what their consumers, this is what their public demands. Airports are doing that as well, and retailers. Others are just sitting back thinking, well, maybe 1 or 2 shops and cafes will do it, we don't need to bother. And perhaps this is a role in terms of government and a role for political parties to start thinking, even on a local government, DCLG level, let's not just leave it to DCMS. What do we want in our town centres? How do we want to start using this and rolling out an Internet of Things?
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take one more into the other one.
Yeah, Tony Jackson, Huntingdonshire. Really, it's more of a point that I think globalisation is very much more than a zero-sum game. I actually work for a Chinese company who's making a vast inward investment into the UK, largely because of our design skills. They're setting up a processor design facility in Bristol, not one in Cambridge, and they're actually transferring much of their corporate governance function to London because of the reputation of the UK for corporate governance. So that's kind of a very positive thing, I think. But I do actually have a question, which is, what does the panel actually think the biggest risk to our actual success is?
Okay. On the gentleman's first point, I think you're right. I think there is a role for the state to play, whether it's at a national level or local level. How that works, I'm not entirely sure, but I think there is a case for the government to kind of say, like they've done in other areas, say, well, we want X% coverage by this year, and we want to upgrade it in line with some kind of metric that they decide whether it's with our competitor nations or not. And that kind of policy certainty is what businesses want, and that would help give at least some direction on where they're going with this kind of infrastructure. On the corporate governance point, I mean, look, again, I saw this numerous times. It's not just corporate governance. I don't think we recognise enough in the UK what kind of stability. obviously tax is a huge public policy issue, but it's still a relatively stable regime, and people believe that it's a stable regime. We've got one of the best tax collection authorities in the world, which people look towards as an example of good practice. We've got a welfare system that people generally look towards for ideas on what to do within their own systems. And the question was, what was the
Biggest risk to success?
biggest risk to success? Procrastination. I mean, I think it's all right. I mean, people procrastinate for years, I'm sure, but I think it really is. It's become more acute issue now because of the pace of change in the rest of the world.
We're almost out of time, so concluding remarks from Jeremy.
I agree with briefly, procrastination and risk aversion is a massive threat to our future prosperity. We have increasingly not just politicians, although politicians are part of the issue, but the population as a large think that all the risk rests on changing, not on staying the same. And I think the whole assumption is flawed. Not all change is good, but at a time of rapid evolution in global marketplaces, the willingness to contemplate change is always good, and many of the actual changes are good as well. And there is a role for government, and most obviously in infrastructure, both digital and transport infrastructure, other forms of infrastructure. My final point, you said a Chinese company. I think that we live in the foothills of globalisation. I think in 30, 40, 50 years' time, people will laugh at the conceit that we thought we lived in a globalised economy in 2040. We're only just getting going. And talking about the sort of digital generation, the young people who grew up unable to remember anything other than computers are only just beginning to work into the marketplace now. And those who actually really grew up with smartphones and things, they're still several years before they start to enter the marketplace. How they approach the world and global interaction intuitively from sort of birth will be different. I think there'll be a step change there. But also globalization has been seen in the minds of Western people as sort of what we do to others. So Apple make things, but they get the thing to be made in China, or Dyson get their vacuum cleaners and clever fans made in Malaysia. But increasingly, it will also be what others do to us. I don't say that as a negative thing, but you wait till some of more South Koreans are outsourcing Samsung production to Britain, and that's great. It's great, and that's why we have to be an outward-looking country that can seize the opportunity of globalisation, including having an aviation policy which is compatible with that. But in our mindset more generally, we can't cut ourselves off. We need to think about how we can be at the sort of crossroads of innovation so that we can prosper and succeed.
Thank you. Any final sentence?
I was just thinking about your question, the biggest risk to our success, and I think it's probably complacency. So getting to that point, thinking that we've won, there's no point in being you get to that bit of complacency, and then just sustaining that rate of innovation.
Well, thank you all for coming, and please join in thanking our panel.